Lao PDR, as it's officially called these days, is the place where most of the common assumptions about young societies, communist countries, Southeast Asia, and a few other things go to die. Everything you thought you knew likely doesn't apply here. Everything you may be tempted to logically assume may not apply here. In the previous episode, I said that the nightlife isn't particularly animated. Well, there is one exception to that. Check this out.
You can buy the best shit. Buy our shit if you want.
ถูกต้องเดี๋ยวให้ทีมงานเขาจะคนเลยดิโอเค continue มีแอป activity น้องผู้ใดอีก2ยังอีก3คนน้องผู้ใดที่ว่ามีแอป activity ยังอีก3คนมากิจกรรมจอกว่าเอา10พันกี่ถูกต้องนักล่านักล่า
This is from a religious holiday turned into a capitalist festival by the communist regime. The only foreign visitors who really liked it were those from the immediate region, with the caveat that even they remarked that it's a bit over the top. Europeans had mostly the same reaction as I did. So how did a communist state end up turning a large religious celebration into a capitalist consumerist festival, all while the officialdom, as you can see, is very careful to be seen doing the proper Buddhist observance with the occasion? Let's explore. Hello everyone and welcome to the third featured installment of the Khmer series. Okay, so in the previous episode it was said that the history of Lao is pretty short. What was meant by that is that the idea of Lao nationality is pretty short, under 200 years old, and the geopolitical entity called Lao is even shorter than that. That's not to say there isn't plenty of ancient history here. There is, just like everywhere in Indochina. But most of the pre-1840 history is one of warfare over depopulated areas. You see, the geography of this place is really harsh. It's landlocked and full of mountains and dangerous woods. Hardly a place to settle long-lasting civilizations for most of history. What you had most of the time was weak kingdoms which invariably ended up being de facto protectorates of either China or Siam. The flooding brought periodically by the Mekong River and its affluents or tributaries made the whole settling business even more complicated. In fact, it's still complicated today. Nearly 3/4 of Lao is uninhabited and uninhabitable even with modern technology, which is why it's so attractive as a route today for drugs and in the past for Vietnamese communists for their war. We'll get to that later on in this video. But until then, it's worth spending a few minutes on the first 100 or so years of history of Lao before we get to the communism part. So, around 1840s, taking advantage of yet another political weakness in the kingdoms of Vientiane and Luang Prabang, the first Lao peoples, including the Hmong, the Mien, the Yao, and the other Sino-Tibetan groups, began settling in the higher elevations of what is today the northern province of Phong Sa-Li and northeast Laos, thus triggering the phenomenon alluded to in the previous episode. People groups who lived in the neighboring countries that didn't like the direction of those countries slowly moved here. This phenomenon continued until late 1960s, although that's not the story you'll be told in Lao, even though the government begrudgingly admits that there's no way anyone could have checked even way into the late 1970s. Now, in the previous episode, I said that Lao is basically 3 people groups, 2 from China and 1 from Cambodia. The Lao, those who speak a tonal Thai language and comprise a slight majority at around 55%, the Khmu, which speaks Khmer and is overwhelmingly from present-day Cambodia, and the Hmong, a very rural and superstitious people group to this day that comes entirely from China. One of the reasons they are here is because in China they weren't even recognized as a people group, they aren't today either, but rather as a subgroup of the Miao people. Miao being a derogatory designation meaning barbarians. Long story about China's treatment of ethnic minorities. Maybe some other time. But the thing is that these three ethnic groups make up about 75% of the country. The other 25% is, well, others. And by others, I mean another 157 ethnic groups, a lot of them with their own language and routinely with very distinct cultures. This also skews the religious statistics as well. 65% of the population is Buddhist, specifically Theravada Buddhist, and 31.4% are classified as no religion. But unlike other places, this doesn't mean they're atheists or non-religious. The communist state has been trying for decades to at least tone down, if not eliminate, what is locally known as spiritual worship and other animist beliefs regarded by the educated elites in Vientiane as a hindrance to the development of the country. Suffice to say that that didn't quite work out. But one reminiscence of that policy goal is the fact that tribal superstitions and animist beliefs are not recognized at all in Lao census, not even as other. Buddhism, Christianity, Islam, atheist, and no religion are the options. Anyway, back to migration, this continued unimpeded all throughout the colonial era as well. The French arrived in the 1860s and at first were in fact preferred as colonial overlords because they didn't get involved in the internal affairs too much and also insisted on abolishing slavery, a significant step forward from the Siamese overlords who were, by comparison, worse. Moreover, the first French governor of what was now the Lao Protectorate actually cared for the security of the place too. For the first time ever, in 1887, someone stopped the bandits from China who were trying to settle a score with Siam. For most of history prior to this moment, Lao was the battlefield between various Chinese factions and Siam. This boded well for both the French interests, who were now establishing themselves as a legitimate power, and for the local Laotian interests. One thing led to another, and in 1893 the Franco-Siamese crisis leads to a recognition of French claims in Lao, and by 1899 the current map formed, and it was governed centrally from Vientiane. The French chose Vientiane for both logistical reasons, as it was centrally located between the lowlands and Luang Prabang, and for the brownie points reasons. The French were keenly aware that the locals saw the destruction of Vientiane by the Siamese 100 years prior as a wound, so France rebuilding it gained a lot of local trust in the new colonial overlord. So what you're seeing now in this footage from Vientiane is a city overwhelmingly built by the French. However, the love story would end abruptly and soon enough, because in the end Lao was still a depopulated place and was thus not particularly important for France beyond its existence as a buffer state between Siam and what is today Vietnam, which was far more important economically for France. It also didn't help that the French started doing more or less what Siam had been doing, only with a smiley face, namely to bring in more people, Vietnamese in particular, thus making the Lao a minority in their country. And if that sounds familiar, it's because these things never change. You will never hear the Japanese invasion being referred to as an overall positive event, but this is Lao. So in Lao, this actually was a good thing in a convoluted, roundabout way, as with everything Lao. So, long story short, under French rule, the Vietnamese were encouraged to migrate to Lao, which was seen by the French colonialists as a rational solution to the labor shortages. By 1943, the Vietnamese population was forming the majority in the largest cities of Lao and enjoying the right to elect its own leaders. 53% of the population of Vientiane, 85% of Tha Hec, and 62% of Pac She were Vietnamese, with the only exception being Luang Prabang, where the population was still predominantly Lao. As late as 1945, the French drew up an ambitious plan to move a massive number of Vietnamese to three key areas, that is to say the Vientiane Plain, the Savannakhet region, and the Bolaven Plateau, which was really not that different from what Siam had been trying to do 60 years prior. And the whole plan was only derailed by the Japanese invasion of Indochina. If not for that, Laotians would have lost control over their country. Certainly, the Axis-aligned Japan didn't intend to save the Laotian state, but this was the result. After Japan's surrender, the French came back and wanted to continue to rule as if nothing had happened. But a lot had happened. During World War II, Vichy France, Siam, now Thailand, and Imperial Japan took turns in occupying Laos. Everyone had seen not only that the French can be beaten, but also that ultimately they weren't too different from previous colonial overlords in the sense that they still wanted to fill in the country with foreigners for economic reasons, so that the line continues to go up, local and indigenous interests be damned. And again, if that sounds familiar, it's because the fundamentals don't change, only the excuses and the sideshows. Also, the more economically important colony, Vietnam, also started to have the same opinion. Turns out they didn't quite like being resettled into Laos either. Long story short, the First Indochina War breaks out immediately after World War II, and this is where things get complicated. A complication with Vietnam that would then remain in Laos' political scene all the way till present day, and a complication that made life in Laos far worse for almost 40 years, until it finally got better again. You see, when you fight a war of independence, in this case, from Laos' perspective, you go to war with the army you have, and most of the available army was from the remnants of the Indochinese Communist Party. The Laotian faction was called Pathet Lao, or Laos People's Liberation Army, and the Vietnamese faction was called the Viet Minh. These two, backed by the Soviet Union, fought the French until 1953 when they won. De jure, the war ended in 1954 with the Geneva Conference. The newly proclaimed constitutional monarchy, however, would only get a bit over 2 years of actual peace, from the proclamation in October 1953 and until November 1955 with the onset of the Second Indochina War, known in the West as the Vietnam War. The reason for the two names is pretty simple. The United States and its allies were trying to fight the Vietnamese communists. But on the ground, the Vietnam War was quite a lot about Laos and Cambodia, as most of the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran through Laos. That trail kept the Viet Cong in the war for so long, so it was crucially important for the communists to keep using it, and crucially important for the United States and its allies to stop it. As a result, for nearly a decade, eastern Laos was subjected to some of the heaviest bombing in the history of warfare, and the effects of that are still being felt to this day. There's a reason the best experts in mine clearance today are either from Laos or Cambodia, or they've gotten their expertise here. Soon it will be 50 years since the end of the Second Indochina War, and there are still over 80 million unexploded ordnances in Laos alone. Keep in mind that a third of the bombs thrown by the United States at the Ho Chi Minh Trail didn't explode. Now, when you visit Laos today, one part of studying the country does involve visiting places like these, where you get to learn about the human toll and the lingering effects of the Vietnam War. But one thing becomes obvious real fast while discussing the Vietnam War in Laos. There's very little anti-American rhetoric. At first, I thought it's because some of these places, as well as most of the demining efforts, are in fact funded by the United States as well, so you wouldn't want to piss off the funder. This hypothesis rings somewhat true once you step into the National Museum, where there's plenty of praise for the useful idiots in the West during the Vietnam War. But even here, the amount of anti-American rhetoric is surprisingly low. Now, there are three reasons for this. One, the bombings weren't exactly controversial even when they were happening. Two, the Lao People's Revolutionary Party of today has a pro-Vietnamese faction, and believe it or not, modern-day Vietnam is in fact very Western-friendly because they really don't like China. And reason number three, well, enough time has passed and this is still Laos, so the laid-back attitude applies to these things too. But the first two reasons actually do matter. So, I was saying that the bombings weren't exactly controversial even as they were happening. Well, for the most of the Vietnam War, Laos was still a constitutional monarchy, which held elections, and the right wing was in fact very much pro-US, while the constitutional left wing was not a big fan of the Viet Cong. Moreover, the communist-aligned far left was in favor of the Viet Cong, but also understood that the bombings are part and parcel of being in the war. So in other words, even during the bombing campaign, there wasn't much controversy in Laos about this. Also, the bombing wasn't exactly random. Yes, it was brutal, but it was also remarkably precise. The civilian toll on the Ho Chi Minh Trail bombings remained very low throughout the war. As this museum in Luang Prabang explains, more Laotians died after the war as a result of unexploded ordinances than during the war itself. This fact, while tragic, improved humanity's knowledge on how to manage post-war situations, but also limited the extent of criticism to the US and Thailand over this. Oh yeah, people don't know, but Thailand was in fact also involved in operations in Laos and Cambodia during the Vietnam War. That's why the term the Second Indochina War is preferable, because that's what it really was. The whole region was engulfed in war, and it was a lot more complicated than the public debate in the West or the communist world explained it. To drive this point home, I'll mention this. The elections in May 1958 in the Kingdom of Laos delivered a right-wing government in power. This wasn't by accident. Right-wing politicians were heavily supported by the United States, in part because they opposed the Viet Cong. That government didn't last long, but while the right was in power, the Communist Vietnamese army alongside the Laotian communists seized the transportation hub on the Laotian route, or the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This aspect ended up strengthening the elite's support for the bombings. Remember, all of this was happening while the Lao part of the war was a secret in the United States, while the US was funding most of this. Speaking of US funding, not all of it went to the military. This is the Gate to Victory, or Pas to Sai. It's also called the Arc de Triomphe of Vientiane due to its uncanny semblance with the Parisian monument. Except it's riddled with Laotian motifs and built in a Laotian design, although not all of it is fully visible because it was under reparations when we got here. This wasn't supposed to be here, but the royalists used the US money and US delivered concrete that was supposed to be for an airport to make this, which led to the locals calling it the vertical runaway. It's just another story of war funds being a grift as well. Anyway, long story short, the situation becomes untenable because while the royalist army was well funded by the US, it was still not training fast enough to be able to do timely offensives against the communists. So the king makes a deal with the devil, or with this guy, Prince Subhanuvong, also known as the Red Prince. The king gave the communists 2 seats in the cabinet, and in return, Subhanuvong would integrate 1,500 of his 6,000 communist troops into the royal army. Of course, like any deal with the communists, this didn't work out. Just a bit over a year later, Pathet Lao, that would be the Red Prince's communist army, invaded the country alongside the Vietnamese and took over most of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, thus stabilizing and then slowly improving the logistics for the Viet Cong's war effort against the US-backed South Vietnam. This was in late 1959. By 1962, it became clear that the coalition government was a bad idea, but by that time, the communist infestation was too much. Except nobody thought so at the time, so the internal fighting continued with the communists funded by the USSR and the Royal Laotian Army funded by the United States, and with air support for the royalists also from the US, but also Thailand and other allies. At some point in the mid-1960s, the bombing would take place 24 hours a day. It was the most real incarnation of bombings will continue until morale improves. Except morale did not improve because of various factors, chief among them being that too many of the royalists in Laos were communists themselves, and the Soviet-funded subversion and agitprop quote-unquote peace campaigns in the West eventually worked. The Tet Offensive didn't help either. Long story short, by 1973, the joint forces of Pathet Lao and People's Army of Vietnam were controlling most of both countries, and all they had to do was to just continue to advance. And so they did. In under 2 years, Cambodia became communist, more on that in episode 6, and the democratic government in Laos was gone with the abdication of the king in December 2nd, 1975. That is the actual date of the end of the war here, almost 3 years after the withdrawal of the United States and almost a year after the date written down on English language resources. And from this moment on, the history of the region gets split again. Cambodia's communist regime will end up not lasting for too long, and the Socialist Republic of Vietnam ends up being the regional power, effectively outpacing Thailand and also keeping the CCP in check. In a very roundabout way, as it's customary in this region, after a 20-year war technically won by the pro-Soviet communists, the whole region ended up de facto capitalist, and with Vietnam becoming not just pro-West, but pro-USA in particular. This is something that very few are talking about. But there are very few places in the world where the United States is more popular than it is in Vietnam. The US is less popular in Canada than it is in Vietnam. And although there are no official numbers, I would wager to say that the US is more popular here in Lao PDR than in Canada. But the road to this present was not easy. So, after the Red Prince becomes the first president, he proceeds to behave like the king he replaced, namely to be the nice, smiley, well-polished figurehead. The actual nitty-gritty on running the country fell onto this guy, Kaizom Pomvihan, the General Secretary of the Lao People's Revolutionary Party, the son of a Vietnamese father and a Laotian mother, and the actual policy wonk of the whole communist movement. De jure, he served as Prime Minister from December 1975 and until August 1991, and from then till his death in November 92 as the second President of Lao PDR. It is quite unfortunate that filming inside this house is not permitted. I would have wanted to make a comparison between the house of this dictator and Ceausescu's house, which I will eventually show to you some other time. But also this place shows just how much of a nerd Comrade Quezon was. And not the fake kind of nerd like Elena Ceausescu or Kim Jong-un. This guy spoke Khmer, Russian, Mandarin, Vietnamese, French, and of course, Laotian. He could also reasonably read in English and Spanish. And if you look into how he ran the party, you can see that as far as communist leaders go, this guy was actually very skilled as a statesman. And I will say very skilled at keeping the party in check as well, which is a very rare quality in leaders like these. Which explains why modern-day party apparatchiks are at best lukewarm to his legacy, and also why Western leftists aren't particularly interested in him. So, while he was only half Laotian, Quezon ran the country in a Laotian spirit, half-hearted. For instance, as soon as he took power at the behest of those who funded the communist effort, that would be the Soviet Union, the country adopted Soviet-styled planned economy alongside Soviet accounting system. As you can see in this footage, the party meetings also pretty much resembled the Soviet Union, with anti-American slogans, a rigid plenary, and an overall Soviet imagery to complete the Soviet economy. Trouble is that this worked as expected. Within 2 years, the country started experiencing food shortages worse than during the war, and on top of that, the dogmatic materialist approach to culture led to an open conflict with the majority Buddhist population and with the minority animist population. Turns out that messing with their beliefs and their food is kinda bad, actually. So, while the world wasn't up to speed to what Pol Pot was doing in neighboring Cambodia, Comrade Quezon was. and he didn't want to go there, but didn't want to upset the Soviet Union or Vietnam either. Eventually, a combination of luck and half-heartedness did bring better results. By 1980, the collectivization process was stopped. The Soviet accounting system was abandoned, and on the religion part, the regime simply folded on everything except making Buddhism de jure state religion. As mentioned in previous episodes, the state takes care of all of the temples, and while in the 1980s the state attempted to regulate the curricula under which the monks studied, that was gradually phased out de facto because most go to study in Thailand anyway. The regime feared that going to Thailand will result in more anti-communist monks, given the virulent anti-communism that runs through most of Thai schools. In practice, though, this worry proved to be mostly unfounded. However, none of this alleviated the disdain that the Vientiane elites felt for the 30% of the populace which remained animist, or in Vientiane language, cling to superstitious and dangerous nonsense. De facto, a lot of the policies that aim to discourage non-traditional religion have gradually been phased away. However, to this day, the state can shut down your business if you have one of these in front of it. This is a spirit house, or Reantaveda in Khmer, and these are technically banned in Lao because they are connected to the various traditional animistic rituals involving spirits. As you can see, they are also pretty common, but if the state doesn't like you, they can be a legal reason to be audited or harassed in some way, shape or form. But the most daring policy came in 1986, when the party straight up denounced the socialist economic model and came up with the NEM, or the New Economic Mechanism. Now, this wasn't exactly new in the communist world. Something similar, and with the same name, had been tried in the Hungarian People's Republic prior to that, and there was also the Perestroika policy in the Soviet Union. But in Lao, this went much further than anyone else. Remember, in 1986, Tiananmen hadn't happened yet. The big northern neighbor, China, was still doing purges and repression in a way that terrified most of the rest of the communist world by that time. So in 1986, Comrade Quezon comes up with a plan that involved decentralized government control, encouragement of private enterprise alongside state-owned enterprises, and the most daring of all, privatization. Now, they didn't call it privatization, but that's exactly what it was. State enterprises lost their pricing privileges and were ordered to either compete or get shut down and dismantled. Meanwhile, all of the land that had been nationalized just 10 years prior was slowly given back to the people it was nationalized from. In 1986, in a communist country, that was daring. But Comrade Quezon insisted that this is the best way to turn this place around and finally breaking the cycle of being a depopulated backwater with a basket case of an economy. Well, what can I say? Almost 40 years later, it's self-evident that he had a point. But the path was nowhere near that easy, because by 1986 the party had developed a pro-Chinese faction too. And again, in 1986 the party line in Beijing was nowhere near that daring on economic issues and definitely not as laid back on social issues like Mr. Quezon, who of course belonged to the pro-Vietnamese faction, was on all of them. And, like in any communist organization, seniority prevailed and Comrade Quezon's ideas went through. By 1989, you could see scenes like these. These are scenes from the first elections held in March 1989. These elections were, of course, partially free, some would even say a farce, but that was more than what Lao had seen in decades. Over time, in subsequent years, things would get better at local and provincial level, though national politics would remain locked out for opposition for a lot longer, just as Comrade Quezon intended. Trouble is that Comrade Quezon became a good communist in November 1992 before the completion of his ideas. By this time, the USSR had ceased to exist and the CCP had been opening up after the Tiananmen shock. But Lao Revolutionary Party still had a good old-fashioned succession crisis to deal with, although that crisis had started since 1991 when Comrade Quezon became the second president. With a bit of luck, his hand-picked successor won. This guy, Hamtai Siphandon. At first, it seemed that he'll just continue Comrade Caizon's work, but soon enough, he deviated. You see, Caizon, now basically de facto the founder of the nation, may have had the basic ideas right about how to turn the economy around, but his other ideas were less than bright. As late as 1991, political dissent of any kind was harshly punished. Non-Vietnamese influences were rigorously policed, foreign investment was still excessively restricted, and leaving the country was still difficult, though permitted. All of that changed from 92 onwards. Newspapers in English started being approved, speech controls were loosened, and foreign investment and aid was deregulated. In under 2 years, this became possible. The idea of a Western-built piece of infrastructure made for connectivity purposes abroad, and all of that announced in an English-language newspaper, was unimaginable in 1991, but as you can see, was the new normal by April 1994. Things were still complicated because while opening up to the world was all great, you still needed basic things like a settled border. Comrade Caizon had started the process in the 70s with Vietnam, but then abandoned it. The talks resumed in 94, and it took all the way till 2007 to finally settle the border with Vietnam, and that's without any animosity between the two countries, and it still took 13 years. Similarly, the post-Caizon government worked to finally finish the border agreement with Myanmar. This newspaper article from 1995 only mentions that the issue is finally settled, but it doesn't mention that the issue had been lingering since the 1970s because Comrade Caizon didn't want to piss off the Burmese path to socialism comrades that ruled Myanmar with Soviet support. That's why in the previous series I emphasized so much just how amazingly fast Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan went from fighting each other to fixing over 1,000 kilometers of border in under 2 years. That is very rare in post-colonial Asia. In this respect, Lao is more like the norm, perhaps one of the few aspects where Lao is normal. But on a more serious note, the post-Caizon regime had a lot of international relations to fix, especially with Thailand and China. But just like the West, the elite in Vientiane didn't see, or didn't want to see, the inherent danger of cozying up with the CCP. But, unlike the West, Lao neighbors China, so it didn't take that long for the pro-Chinese faction to eventually end up in power, and once that happened, the usual problems started happening as mentioned in the previous episode. Also, while Lao is technically not a post-communist country, a lot of the very familiar post-communist ills did and still do manifest in Lao, such as rampant inflation and rampant corruption being chief among them. Now again, that's not to say corruption didn't exist prior to 1992, it absolutely did. But the trade-off of going richer at a fast pace while remaining a partially state-controlled economy is a very rapid increase in corruption. You couldn't make $1 million at all in 1986, no matter who you knew. But by 1996 it became possible if you knew the right people and got into the correct contracts, or got into the drug trade. The flip side of that was a very rapid increase in home ownership. Lao became, and remains to this day, the country with the highest home ownership rate in the world, and unlike China, this was achieved without building ghost towns or getting most of the populace in crippling debt. Now, of course, one can argue that the context in the mid-1990s was favorable, just like it was in other post-communist countries. But the thing is that home ownership rate continued to increase or stay very high, above 95%, all throughout this period. To be fair, it was pretty high during Caizon as well, but the abolition of state-owned homes and the liberalization of the construction sector did wonders for both the locals and the new immigrants. Oh, that's another change. The idea of immigrants of any kind was unheard of in Lao in 1992. Of course, the trade-off is not always great, because in addition to skilled laborers, Lao got a bit of a taste of the Chinese organized crime as well. Not as bad as Cambodia, more on that in future episodes, but still pretty bad to the point that Lao had to adopt policies incongruent with its status. Traditionally, poor countries have very relaxed visa policies. Well, Laos is still very poor, but its visa conditions are more similar to a high middle-income country if you want to stay here. Also, having seen what happened to portions of Thailand and Cambodia due to excessive numbers of visitors, Laos also has some specific rules aimed at foreigners, such as having Islamic level of restrictions on sexual interactions between foreigners and locals. A lot more on this in episode 10, when we tackle the current challenges. But until then, let's wrap up the contemporary period economically and politically, which can be summed up as follows. The pro-Chinese faction ended up in power in 2006, or 2001, depending on who you choose to believe. The reason there's two dates is because after 98, the system in which the president is basically a constitutional king with no serious power, and the power is vested into the prime minister who is checked by the National Assembly, which in turn is 98% Lao Revolutionary Party. Well, all of that, became murkier after 1998. Since 1998, actual opposition MPs now exist. They're not many, but they're vocal, and some of the power is now de facto with the president as well. The prime minister is still the most important figure, but the geopolitics are a split business. So the first clearly pro-Chinese president came in 2006, but the first pro-Chinese prime minister came in 2001. Whichever date you choose to believe, one thing is clear. After 2006, the economy started to look more Chinese. The most obvious sign is the train system, built almost from scratch. Laos never had a railways network prior to that. It's operated entirely by Chinese contractors, and the main purpose of the railway system is to transport raw materials from Laos to China, for which the CCP pays next to nothing. These trains are the only visible, functional and completed examples of the Belt and Road Initiative, and as things stand, they'll likely stay the only examples for many years to come, given that most of the other projects in other places were cancelled once countries figured it out just how predatory the whole system is. Still, funny story about these trains. The stations are in the middle of nowhere. The most extreme contrast is in the capital city. The airport is in the middle of the city, while the railway station is 20 kilometers away from the city center. The same is true in Luang Prabang, Van Vieng, and pretty much all over the place. At first, I thought the Chinese built them this way, thinking that those cities would expand, but no. It was in fact Lao popular request. Street folklore has it that the reason was to maintain a transportation grift. And to be fair, it's working. No matter how skilled you are with negotiation, you're still going to pay about the same price to move from the railway station into the city as you paid to ride the train. And it's not just foreigners. Locals get grifted in a similar fashion too, although there are cheaper alternatives if you don't carry a big luggage and are okay with basically zero comfort. But other than that, in these railway stations, you are in China. There's a very severe security check getting into the stations. This is unheard of anywhere else in Laos. Even getting into governmental buildings, there's not much bother. But since the CCP is running these, they're run on CCP rules. And they're quite insane. You can't have nail clippers with you, for instance. The Lao elite de facto has no say in how the passenger trains are run, and it's the kind of colonization that is starting to piss off the locals and some of the factions within the Lao Revolutionary Party. So this will be interesting to watch in the following years. The most notable reaction so far is that the extension to this route will not be built with a Chinese contractor according to a 2023 decree. This was also unimaginable 5 years ago. So we'll see what happens. But perhaps the most spectacular development is the energy sector. You wouldn't think such a poor place would have a functional energy sector, but not only it does, but it powers up its neighbors as well. In Cambodia, power outages are common, so are generators. In Laos, power outages are an outrage. They just don't happen. Not anymore, anyway. Although the country's overall economy grew really fast in the last 15 years, the share of the economy occupied by the energy sector still more than doubled from around 6% in 2012 to a bit over 13% in 2024. Most of it is hydro and other so-called green energy, and it also hides great stories about how environmentalism is ultimately geopolitics. For instance, in 2012, the Finnish firm Pöyry Engineering consulted for the Mekong Commission on how to build the Changyabar hydropower plant on the Mekong River, all part of a discussion that had started in 2007 and had the agreement of the countries that may have been affected both positively and negatively, namely Vietnam, Cambodia, and Thailand. But suddenly, as soon as the plans made by the Finns went public, out of nowhere appeared environmentalist NGOs who were suddenly also concerned with the fish and the ecosystem that would be so negatively affected by the new dam. Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State in the US, was also very concerned about the environmental impact at the ASEAN summit in 2012. Those exact same concerns disappeared literally overnight when the Western contractors were replaced with a contractor from Thailand. Amazing how that works. The dam was built and it's been operating since 2019. Somehow, no catastrophe occurred ever since, except the imagination of Chinese and Western-funded NGOs. It is, of course, just a pure coincidence that it's Chinese and Western firms that are salty for not having been included in this grift. Even so, most of the energy sector is owned and operated by other French or Chinese companies. The Chinese own the coal, the French own the transmission, and most of the hydro, with the Lao government and a few Thai companies owning the remainder. All of this arrangement is not significantly different from what you can see in most countries of Europe. You can count this as an appreciation for Lao's reforms or as a critique of Europe. Depends on your worldview, of course. One thing that remains true, though, is that all of this allowed for a lot more corruption than ever in history, while at the same time allowing for the fastest growth in standard of living in the history of this place. This should tell you that generic anti-corruption stances are not inherently for the benefit of society. But of course, if you say that out loud, you'll be lambasted by the hordes of brainwashed zombies who genuinely believe that such thing as a non-corrupt government can exist. So, in a way, we can appreciate the commies in Lao for simply admitting that that's not possible, a realization that has yet to hit Beijing, but that's a story for another day. In the previous episode, I mentioned that due to incompetence and the laid-back attitude, the information space of Lao ends up being de facto the freest in the region. Well, one way to evaluate that is through the fact that some of the information used in this video is from two books that I bought from the state printing house. Books that are far from kind to the communist regime are reprinted and sold in the state bookstore network. The idiosyncrasies of this regime are endless and pretty much at random. I could go on for another 2 or 3 hours with even more examples, but the point has been well made. So, lastly, let's look at present day from the moment these images were taken in late 2023. Well, for starters, protests have slowly become more common. They're still very polite and very Laotian, that is to say, they don't last long and they do follow the routine for breaks. But the topics are in line with what was predicted earlier in this series, namely the abuses by the Chinese contractors. Unfortunately, that won't change anytime soon because the pro-Chinese faction is still very much entrenched in power. Still, there is one good news. The Golden Triangle, that would be the de facto autonomous state within Myanmar that fuels the drug trade throughout Indochina, has finally been feeling some pressure as a result of the fact that the current government in Laos was more likely than others to allow Chinese intervention. The bad news is that the intervention follows Chinese obsessions. chief among them being gambling, which here really means money laundering, an issue of little relevance for Lao. It's the drugs that are affecting society here, but that will have to wait a little bit more because it's not China's priority. However, China's interests and the shifting regional politics are bound to enter a collision course, and not unlike other periods of history, a lot of the fighting will take place in Lao as the not exactly willing host. It won't be physical like in the 19th century, and indeed Lao may gain something out of it, but it will require a type of wisdom that few are sure it can be found among the Vientiane elite. What I'm referring to is the economic struggle derived from onshoring. You see, people seem to think that onshoring is a Western thing. Well, it may have started in the West, but it's a thing all over the world, and the reason China is upset is because China stands to lose the most out of it. Less than 10 years ago, China bragged about its success of its Made in China strategy. Fast forward to 2024 and you have firms from Thailand looking for strategic expansion into Laos as a bet to attract even more relocation from China. In a twist of irony, the only successful incarnation of the Belt and Road Initiative may end up being used to ship capital goods away from China. Will the communist government here have the wisdom to take advantage of this? I don't know. Nobody does. But it's something to keep an eye on if you're interested in the whole onshoring business. One thing is certain, though. The transformations that Laos is facing now are just as profound as those that started in 1991 and arguably ended in 2015 or so. Although per capita Laos is still poor, it's no longer the irrelevant backwater of early 1980s. A decade of being in top 10 fastest growing economies in the world have turned this place into a relevant enough ground that attracts interest, both positive and negative. So the anachronistic way this regime still functions will have to face this. If I am to bet, I'll bet that all of this will go down the Lao way. Any change will be postponed for as long as possible and the state will be the last to even notice. Heck, I'm not even saying this is a bad thing. It's a strategy that worked pretty well, both in late 70s and in the 90s. A lot of communist countries went into civil wars when the Soviet Union fell or had nasty Tiananmen-style moments. Meanwhile, this place got even more peaceful. So, if you look at this through an exclusively economic line goes up mentality, then it's not great news. But if you look at it more holistically, the results are more comme ci comme ça, as the former colonial overlords would have said, or atât s-a putut, as we routinely say on the sofa. Ultimately, this isn't a praise or a critique of Laos. This place has its own pace, and it is unwilling to change that. Lao will accept more change, but at its own pace and with the idiosyncrasies that it enjoys, and there's not much anyone can do about it. Which is why, ultimately, Lao is an acquired taste. Nobody instantly likes Lao, not the communists, not the kleptocrats, not the capitalists, and certainly not the globalists. So this would be a good note to end this. Laotian communism is one big soup. Some would resemble it with the Vietnamese pho, others with the Turkish chorba, others with the Russian borscht, or maybe others with the Chinese keng. Trouble is that everyone is right and wrong at the same time. The only thing we can all agree with is that Laotian communism is a soup, the most idiosyncratic soup you'll likely ever see. And that's that. And with all of that being said, thank you all for watching. Don't forget to subscribe. Many thanks to the donor circle. And if you like this kind of content, please consider supporting the next series as we're heading to Latin America. And with that, I will see you all soon on the Freedom Alternative.